Welcome to the Ab Astra podcast. Today we have with us Professor Nicolas Weill-Parot, who has been a researcher on the history of science, particularly in the medieval West. He is a professor at l'Ecole Pratique des Hautes Etudes, and he has been researching a lot of subjects related to the history of astrology, magic, talismans, and welcome, Professor.
Welcome.
So, could you tell us a little bit about your work and how it relates to the history of astrology, where it intercepts this area?
Well, when I was younger, I wrote a doctoral thesis on astral magic. That is astrological talismans. So that was the door to this discipline of astrology. I mean, I was not specifically working on astrology, but on astral magic. Then my main field of research was the confrontation between science and magic, because this was the main problem raised by the issue of astrological talismans. And now I am mostly working on physical science, physics, so less in astrology. So, I mean, this is difference between my works and the work of scholars as David Just or Jean-Patrice Boudet, who are more focused on the astrology, astrological techniques.
Okay.
So, but anyway, when you study astral magic, it has this, it intercepts with astrology. Even though your focus is not specifically astrology, the manufacturing of talismans is closely related, as far as I can understand, it's closely related to the choice of specific dates or specific configurations that would favor the talisman that was being manufactured. So, did you in your doctoral thesis, did you address this point, the choice of dates?
Yes, of course, because the astrological images or astrological talismans, what we call the scientia imaginum, the science of images, is generally located under this part of astrology which is called the elections.
Yes. Yes.
So naturally, we can say that the science of astrological talismans is part of astrology. Is a part, is a subpart, is a subdivision of the science of elections. But of course, it's partly astrological and partly magical.
Partly magical. I don't know, given the importance of astrological thought in pre-modern times, I don't know how much we can separate for someone who was at that time manufacturing a talisman. This would come, I think, naturally, like manufacturing the talisman physically and then thinking of the specific day to I don't know, to use the talisman or something. So it would be like, as you said, an election, electing or choosing the right date for an action, for doing something. In this case, a talisman. Yeah, please go on.
No. You're perfectly right. In fact, there were in the Middle Ages some activities that were thought as depending from the astrological time. This is specifically the case of astrological images. But if you take another example, in alchemy, it is not the case. Most of alchemists say that you can do the operation, whatever. You have not to take into account the astrological time. So it's very specific. The astrology was very important in my topic because I was my thesis was dealing with a specific kind of astrological talisman. These talismans, which were called astrological images with brackets, like the American do. Okay, because this was a specific term to build up an idea of a purely naturalistic talisman. I mean, a talisman which didn't imply rituals, calling from spirits, etc. So, if you want to make a naturalistic talisman, the easiest way to justify is to tell that this talisman depends from natural astral forces.
Yes. Yes, it's in line with certain configurations. And these talismans were used for what kind of purposes, what kind of goals were they used for?
Well, in fact, you have to, generally, astrological talismans, because you have to make the distinction between astrological talismans, which is a real practice, and astrological image, which is not a category coming from the magician's mind, but from the intellectual mind. It's sort of an idea of an ideal talisman, which not really match with what you can find in the traditional text related to the practice of astrological talismans. But to answer to your question, astrological talismans had very different goals. You can destroy a city. You can, you can make two people love each other. But when the category of astrological image were coined, I mean precisely in the middle of the 13th century, in this book, which name is Speculum Astronomiae, the mirror of the science of stars, a book which were attributed to Albert the Great, but obviously it's not Albertus Magnus' books. This category was coined and later was used mostly by some physicians. So one of the aim, an easy aim, an acceptable aim, was to cure some diseases. In particular, the seal of the lion, the seal with the figure of the sign of the lion, was used against kidney stones. Because, of course, if you want, in an academic milieu, if you want to defend a licit talisman, you can say, students, you can do these talismans to destroy your enemy. No, the only aim that was
medicine.
Yeah, medicine, of course.
Yes, medical purpose.
Medical thing.
Yeah, was always a medical practices was always a way to
safe way
to present.
Yes, but in fact, as I noticed, this was an empirical slightly used. I mean, scholastic medicine is very rational and it's a Galenic frame. So there are few examples of this, but it's not. We cannot say that the scholastic medicine was magical. That's wrong.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I was curious. Does this part of teaching of the images appears in the regular teaching of astrology at this time, if we can call it that? So, in the context of an academic, a university, would this be part of the curriculum, or would be something a little bit on the side? If you understand my question.
In fact, the problem is, were there really an official teaching of astrology in the Middle Ages? That is another problem. In France, probably not. There was probably some specific lessons, extraordinary lessons on the Centiloquium of Theodore Ptolemy. But as Jean-Patrice Boudet has said, even the Collège of Maître Gervais was not really a college for astrologers. In Italy, the situation was probably quite different. I mean, probably astrology was more efficient in the curriculum. But anyway, no, I don't know. I don't think that there was a teaching on astrological talisman at university. Of course not. What I have found, it's the allusion to this practice is incidental in some treatises of astrology, but very incidental, or in the works by physicians, also very, I mean, punctual. I don't know the term in English. Very occasional, very occasional. You can find the first, as far as I know, the first physician who did mention this seal of lion was Arnald of Villanova at the beginning of the 14th century. And we know that he made use of this specific talisman to cure Pope Boniface VIII from his kidney ache. And in his treatises, there are few allusions, and it's very specific. I mean, he used an hermetic text, but he gives an explanation, he suggests an explanation which is purely naturalistic. So it's explanation by the concept of specific form and occult property. We will tell about this if you want, but it's you know, this is very important, because these few examples of use of astrological talismans don't lead us to the conclusion that medicine was irrational or magic, but just the contrary, that there were very few, and when they were here, they were encapsulated in a conceptual and rationalistic frame, very strong.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
that is very interesting. It's a bit like astrology, what we study from pre-modern astrology. It is not only natural, but also it has a logic of its own. It has its own cohesion, and it explains itself by rules that, if you understand, you can understand the rules. It's not just something that happens.
Yes,
So I guess magic follows the same rationale or similar.
In this specific,
Yes.
because I was thinking as you were talking, it is true that most books on astrology, if we go and make a link of the main books on astrology, very, very few have a section on talisman or images. usually it's outside. It's a special book. It's a subject on its own. So yeah. So I found
Yes.
so the teaching would more or less follow, I would think, the same structure.
You can imagine that astrology was not, of course, was not condemned in the Middle Ages, but there were three things an astrologer couldn't do if he didn't want to have some trouble with the church.
Yeah.
If you want to live for an old age.
You see, of course, the freedom of will, the omnipotence of God, and the third one was the mixing astrology and necromancy practice. So, if an astrologer wants to have an authority, seem serious, it was a bit dangerous to speak of this practice, which were magics, because it's not the problem of astrology. Astrology mainly aims to predict the future or to find hidden things. But this is different. The talismans are not predictive talismans. They are it's action. It's to cure, to destroy.
Yes.
Pact. So it's different category. It's not astrology. In fact, it's outside the general aim of astrology. So why an astrologer would take this risk for something which was outside his own field?
Yes.
Yeah, because it would be very serious. It would be a very serious accusation. One thing I remember is that when some books talk about the four main branches of astrology: revolutions of the year, nativities, interrogations or questions, and elections, and then sometimes they separate within elections. They really completely separate the talismans as something else.
Yes.
And this is probably
which is part of elections, as you said, but
a separate part of elections.
Even it's put apart. It's quite interesting.
In fact, there was a debate in the Middle Ages between theologians around this concept of astrological image. Just to give you an example, a great example, Thomas Aquinas was strongly opposed to this concept. Albert the Great was in favor of this
He was more
of the seal, and so I don't think there were condemnation. I don't know condemnation of the use of astrological talismans, but of course there was this idea in the Speculum Astronomiae that you can use this talisman if there are no rituals, no signs addressed to a spiritual entity. What I have called the addressativity in French, disnativité. It's a word I have coined to tell this. If you write words, if you tell words, you are telling to someone. Who is this someone who is hearing you and who is helping you in the magical operation? Of course, a spirit. And in a theological framework, a demon. Angels would not commit in such private aims. So, if you want to build a purely naturalistic practice, you have to build a non-addressative model, a non-addressative pattern. And precisely, as I have said, a natural astral force was a good tool to explain this power without any reference to any spirit.
any
Yeah, so a
familiar
supernatural entity of some sort.
So it would provide a safe explanation, an accepted explanation for the use of these talismans. That's very interesting. And
we can see more or less that line of thought going into the early modern period as well, because then they have a lot of experimentations on the influence of the planets and the natural magic, always in the scientific point of view. It's not a magical, their natural magic is not magic in the sense, perhaps the medieval sense, but it's more of a natural, trying to collect natural forces by means of these tools.
In fact, the general frame was very clear in the Middle Ages. This concept of addressativity was very clear, but the things become more confused during the Renaissance. I mean, at the end of the 14th century, there are few magicians who wrote treatises where the boundaries were not so clear. And of course, with the De Vita of Marsilio by Marsilio Ficino, it's another word. The concept of addressativity is completely perverted and subverted by the Neoplatonistic views, where something can act on something by a relation of sympathetic relationships. So you have a kind of model where even the words can be in a way be said naturalistic, but of course the spirits are part of nature, so everything is going very confused. Middle Ages is very clear.
When it comes to Renaissance or Renaissance spirit, it becomes a bit, we see the same in our studies in astrology. Middle Ages, well, there's Middle Ages, it's the Middle Ages, but we can follow like a line and we understand, and then everything explodes, and not necessarily for the better, because it sometimes becomes a bit more confusing. It's exactly the same with astrology. I have a very basic question that I would like to ask you, and it's really a basic question. These talismans, were they written in paper or parchment? The reason I ask is because I have seen some manuscripts talking about talismans, and some of them are very clear that those images are like something that we write. Some of them, probably other kinds of talismans, they talk about some molding or statues. So how were they, what was the physical aspect of these talismans?
That's a good question. There are different kinds of talismans. We have three-dimensional talismans, statues. This is the talisman described by a very important text, the De Imaginibus by Thabit, ascribed to the Sabian astrologer Thabit Ben Qura. This text is very important because it's the only text that the author of the Speculum Astronomiae can find to exemplify his ideal category of a talisman without any rituals. You see? He say there are basically the Speculum Astronomiae say we have three kinds of images: abominable, that is hermetic images; detestable, this is Solomonic images; and astrological images. That is purely astrological. They only take their power from the stars. And the only text he can find to exemplify this category, which is a category which was born in his own mind, is the De Imaginibus by ascribed to Thabit Ben Qura. But sometimes, in these lines there are some problem, but it's not a problem, so it's a purely intellectual category. In this text, which is described, are not seals. There are statues, molded, yes, you're right. If you want to make two people love each other, you represent a man and a woman. You put them together. You bury them. So it's talisman, three-dimensional. If you want to repel scorpions, you make a statue of the scorpions. That is, you represent the goal, the aim. Okay. This is the first kind. But there are another kind of talismans which are used in medicine that are seals of gold or another metal. The example, the seal of lion, is to be impressed in July when the lion is in the sky, and it's different. It's the same. We can see that there are two different kind of astrological image but it's different. And as you noticed, in the seal of lion, it's not the aim which is represented, but the source, the alleged source of the power. So there's two kinds. Now, are there talisman written? That leads me to another question. What is a talisman? I would define, but it's a category. I choose to define. I choose this term. I am not alone. I think that Brian Copenhaver did the same use. A talisman, I would define every artificial object endowed with magical power. That's the difference between a talisman and an amulet. An amulet, we could say, but it's a choice, it's a lexical choice, that an amulet, it's a purely natural part of body, for instance, a piece of stone, naturally do. Amulets are not magic. They are marvelous, natural, wonderful natural powers. So that would be. If you accept this definition, you have the right not to discuss this category, but we can see in Solomonic magic, for instance, some drawings which obviously can be seen as kind of talismans in this way, because it's an artificial object or drawing with power. I don't know if I really answer your question, but you see that in this direction you can see different kinds. So three-dimensional, seals, and maybe only writing, but it's not really the tradition I have seen. Only writing, in general, in the astrological talisman I have seen, it's not real the case. Maybe there are some few examples, but the talisman I have seen are statuettes, figures, three-dimensional figures, and seals.
Yes, you did answer my question, and you did also raise other questions. This is a good answer. The answer that gives another question. But this is a field that we could just go on forever.
And are there many? That's something got me curious. Are there many examples,
yes,
archaeological examples, so museum examples of this practices?
As far as I know, well, that depends. If you are talking about purely astrological image, it's impossible to know if they were magic or not, because logically you have only a figure of a lion. So
you don't know.
We don't know. But we know, for instance, that in the testament of Arnaldo de Villanova, there were some seals with lions. So it's not an archaeological testimony, but an indirect testimony. In fact, what we know now, there are some astrological seals, but not astrological images. Astrological seals with inscriptions, so they are not theologically, they are not astrological seals, deriving from a text, a magical text wrongly ascribed to Arnaldo Villanova, the De Sigilis, a text probably from the 15th century, which was used by Agrippa of Nettesheim. And we know two talismans, but they probably were probably made in the 16th century. I don't know if someone has discovered a talisman, astrological talisman in the Middle Ages. I don't know.
Okay. Yes.
And I'm still curious about the usages, the different usages. What was, if you can remember, the more curious or interesting or strange purpose that you found in this talisman?
Well, you have in a text wrongly ascribed to Ptolemy, the Opus Imaginum. Well, the author of the Speculum Astronomiae told there are one text I know, which is purely astrological. Maybe a second one. The one text is Fabit de Imaginimus. The second one, maybe the Opus Imaginum by Ptolemy, Pseudo-Ptolemy. But I'm not sure about this second one. So in this text, you can a funny talisman. It's a talisman you make, you bury, in the way, and when maybe when a lady comes, she will she will leave all her she'll I don't know how to say it's. She will become nude. Okay, this is you can see the phantasm of this magician.
So it was buried in the away, yes. And whenever a woman would go by, she would be.
Okay, that's a very
interesting talisman. I hope they use it only in summer, because otherwise during the winter it would be very cruel for the lady. And well, it is. I would like to test that one. Is there also a feminine version for men?
Well, I remember I asked. Yeah, I'm not sure. So you can cut this if it's wrong, because I'm not sure. But I wonder if Jean-Patrice Boudet didn't find something about an Arabic version and Latin version. In the Latin version, it was an heterosexual talisman. In the Arabic version, a homosexual talisman.
Very modern.
Find it.
Okay, so multi-use then.
Multi-use, yes, very good. It's a very versatile technology.
Yes, but I don't think it was this text. It was another text in the Picatrix. I mean, maybe in the Latin and Arabic Picatrix. But you can ask directly to Jean-Patrice Boudet. I think you have told with him recently.
Yes,
we have. It was very, very nice. We have, yes. Yes. Do you have more?
Yes, I would like to ask you now perhaps something different.
Well, I was enjoying this talisman. It was very good.
But something different, perhaps more related to your career in teaching. How do you see, this is a question that we've been asking a lot, but how do you, as an historian of science, how do you see the role of the history of astrology and the importance of the history of astrology in the understanding of ancient science, medieval science?
That's a big question. It's very important. Well, but the problem is how to define astrology. Generally, as Alain de Libera and others told, we can make the distinction between the astral influence, I mean the etiological side of astrology, the idea that the stars, planets, the spheres have an influence on Earth, which is obviously a premise that almost all medieval philosophers and theologians share. And the second, but astrology means something else. It means the capacity of human being to read in the stars the signs of hidden or future things. And if many, almost all the medieval authors would admit the etiological part, that the idea that, but it's not astrology, the idea of the influence. They are not all fond of astrology. If you see, for instance, Thomas Aquinas, of course, Thomas Aquinas, it's very important, this idea of the influence of the spheres, but he's not very interested by astrology. There's a difference between Thomas Aquinas and his friend and master Albert the Great, for instance. Recently, a young searcher, which was my PhD candidate, Maria Sorokina, wrote a very long PhD, more than 1,000 pages, on the debate among theologians concerning the celestial influence.
Well, that would be very interesting. Is it published?
The book will be published in Brepols in, I hope, in autumn.
Oh, good.
I hope. It's a very important book.
Yeah.
And she convincingly argued that the issue of astral influence was a sort of stimulating tool to the progress of science, or to evolution of scientific thought. So I think it's an important, very important book.
It is. We will be looking forward to reading it.
Okay.
Yes. Because one of the things that I've been researching basically, and I'm still in the process of the PhD at this point, which is the Jesuits and their relationship to astrology, and how they relate, and how they teach it, and how they reject it, and all that dynamics. And I was always curious exactly of why haven't anyone still made a work where you have where you analyze this question, the difference between celestial influence, how this is accepted, to which point is it practiced. So it's very good news to see that she had addressed that topic, which is quite good.
Yes. Yeah, we'll be attentively looking for the book. You can tell her that she already has 2 readers.
Exactly.
I will tell.
Yes. Most of the objections to astrology from Thomas Aquinas, if I understood him correctly, relate to the exercise of free will, or the negation of free will. He was very, very worried about this. And actually, it is interesting to see how the idea of astrology develops in a Christian society, or in a monotheistic society, or in a polytheistic society such as India or other branches, where there's not really a problem with free will. So there is this different scenarios where astrology develops.
There are certain questions that do not
They are
come
not
up as a
asked,
problem. It's quite interesting to see.
There was a solution with the theory of inclination. This theory was, but anyway, I think that you can find very few things about astrological techniques in Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, he was mainly concerned with free will and the power of God, because he was a theologian, so that was his concern.
And I think because his text was quite important to allow a certain permissibility of the practice of astrology later on, particularly in the 16th and the 17th century. He is usually seen from that perspective as someone who is more favorable to astrology. But in fact, as you were saying, if you read the text, he's not at all favorable. He just allows that there are some things that can be known through to the natural influence of the celestial bodies. But he limits that very, if you compare the whole practice of astrology and what he allows is a very narrow band of practice.
In fact, I think it's one of my ideas, the Summa Theologia or the Summa Contra Gentiles are he has an exhaustive approach. So he's very rigorous, he's very serious. He say, it's very difficult to say something is strictly impossible. So you say, well, you say no, but of course, finally, if you could say that, it's the same with a very strange section concerning astrological images in the Summa Contra Gentiles. In all the works of Thomas Aquinas, the idea of astrological image is strongly rejected. But there was few lines at the end of chapter 1, it was 105 of the third book of Contra Gentiles. It's an argumentation against magic. He rejected magical words, magical image. But at the very end, he say, one could say that if you make an image, you give quasi forma substantialis, forma specifica, quasi. And so this image would have this power, but if you add some writing, some rituals, it's not natural. Of course, the supporters of magical astrology, of astral magic, saw that and say, you see, Thomas Aquinas is defending. Of course, it's not his aim. It's only because it's a possibility. It's like, I would say in a modern way, it's like you. I don't believe in UFO in general, but can you exclude that? Make the demonstration that the book I see, it's not a UFO. Can you demonstrate? Of course, if you have all the possibility, you will say, well, eventually you can say it's this kind of idea.
You are trying to be very rigorous.
Yes, and the strange thing that Silvestri de Ferrara, which is a Dominican commentator of the Summa Contra Gentiles, but in the 15th century, interprets these lines by Thomas Aquinas like a real concession in favor of astrological images. But I think I am more Dominican than Dominicans, because I think it was not the main idea of Thomas Aquinas.
If we read, we really need to read the text in its full. Otherwise, if we just read one line,
it gets out of context, and the other idea comes out. Yes, it's interesting because it's interesting because we're seeing here, we've been discussing this in the Christian context, of course, in the medieval and even the Renaissance Christian context, where you have all this, you can't do this and you can't do this, and you have restrictions. While in other contexts, we don't have these strictures, so it's the problems are of other kind, and it's quite interesting how in this case religion, and in the case of the talismans and astrology to a certain point, how religion shaped a lot of how the concept of science, or in this case of a knowledge of a discipline, is shaped and molded to a certain direction and not to others.
In fact, most of the and correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the objections in Europe in Christianity are it's not about whether astrology works or not in itself. It's whether astrology is licit or illicit. If we can do it from the perspective of religion, is it licit to do it or not? Then when we come to a later time like Pico della Mirandola and other people, they would object if it really works. It's a different way. When we go to another civilization like India, they don't worry about that. They just practice it in a different mindset.
Probably, but you're partly right. I would say for Middle Ages, but I don't know, because the theologians argue also from a philosophical point of view.
Oh, I see.
That means that they try to understand if really stars can have power on human mind, so it's not only licit or illicit, it's also the capacity of the power of a star, because a hierarchy of powers, human soul are stronger than an influence. So it's not only a question of licit or illicit. They would say that it's like in astrological images. If these talismans are scientifically grounded, have a scientific basis, therefore they are licit. If there are no scientific basis, they are illicit. And of course, there is an example before Pico della Mirandola is Nicolas Weill in the 14th century. His Quaestio contra divinatores is an argumentation built on essentially scientifically, I mean natural philosophical arguments, more than theological. It's from a philosophical point of view. He says that astrology is wrong scientifically, that it does not match with the Aristotelian principles, and he criticized one of the concessions of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas told that, but it was even in this kind of concession at the end of a question in Thomas Aquinas say, of course, astrology doesn't work. You cannot make prediction of individual human beings. But when there are crowds, the crowd, most of people doesn't follow their rational thought. They follow their passions. So statistically, astrology is right because people live like animals, And this point is criticized by Nicolas Weill, because they say, no, it's wrong, because of course you can say that people follow their passions. So if they follow passion, the body, the astral act on body. So the idea of inclination you can explain. So through the inclination, Thomas Aquinas opened the door for naturalistic astrology. Pierre Dailly is using this concession of Thomas Aquinas very, very deeply. I was working on Pierre Dailly astrology before my PhD, but So it's very clear. But Nicolas said, no, it's completely, it's wrong, because, you know, many people drink and they do not need to drink. Their body, they are not thirsty, and they drink wine. So it's a proof that it's not, this pattern doesn't work. So he goes very far in the criticize of astrology. And after him, Heinrich von Langenstein. It's also a very important critic of astrology on scientific, philosophical basis, not only on theological precepts, prescriptions.
That's very interesting, the relation between accepting astrology from the religious perspective, if we can provide a scientific basis, and if not, it will not be accepted. So it had to be natural, and that would give rise to this idea of natural or judicial and everything. That is kind of I would say, an artificial distinction, but because. But yeah, the idea is here that is very, very interesting. Well, for me, is that if you can provide a natural explanation, therefore that's fine. Some of them would say, like the little door, as you said, that Thomas Aquinas opened in the end of the sentence. Some of them just shut the door, and that's nobody. It doesn't work. So we have a little of everything, even in the Middle Ages, as you just said. And the interesting thing is that astrology was never ceased to be discussed. It's something that people discuss, or whether they accept it or reject it, or accept it partially or reject it partially. We can see that also, but it's always under discussion, I would say. So it is one of the interesting parts, sometimes for its solicitude, sometimes for its techniques, sometimes for both. So it's always kind of, it never settles. There are some areas of knowledge, some sciences that just settle. They evolve, of course, but they are what they are. And people go back to astrology to discuss it, to discuss its origins, its functionality, its essence, everything. So it's always like in turmoil. It's one of the interesting parts of this knowledge.
That's fine. It wasn't settled, nor conceptually, nor neither institutionally.
Yes. I think it never was.
It almost fits in a category of its own regarding other disciplines of knowledge. It's always there, and it's connected to astronomy, of course, but it's always in its own pocket.
Can I be a bit polemical? You can cut it if you.
Please.
Nowadays, if you see the scholars who are studying astrology, you may discover that quite a great part of them are actually believing in astrology. It's not my case. I don't believe in astrology. But that doesn't interfere their analysis. I will not give any name, of course, but you have great historians of astrology who believe in astrology, but the work are very scientific. That means that you have this ambiguity even now in the field of the research on astrology.
It will remain forever. It's one of the characteristics of this topic.
So I mean, I don't believe in astrology, but I am not racist. I mean, I have good friends who believe in astrology.
So,
yes, it is. And I think then there's also sometimes a discussion if someone who knows astrology and who works with astrology is more able to analyze or to understand certain practices or certain documents or certain evidences that they found than someone who is outside and probably has some difficulty. So there's a whole mix. But as you said, there has been a lot of very good astrological history of astrology, good scientific work being done by people who were actually practitioners, or at least that do they believe or they practice the subject. So it is always a way, I think, when we slipped into academia, to do a proper scientific historical analysis, objective historical analysis, in this case.
People have to have critical thought,
to produce,
whatever they do.
To produce proper science. And it is an interesting clash between beliefs, ways of seeing the world. Yes,
I would say, as people know how to, wear different hats.
Yes.
In academia, we use the hat of academics. And the other part we use. I also have a joke about this normally, because I say, if the person is a scholar and practices astrology, well, that's fine. If a person is a scholar of the story of cannibalism, and secretly, that would be much more.
Yes.
That would be a problem.
I have no friends cannibals. No friends.
No. I think some topics are more safe than others to practice. No, I always have this joke because people tell about this. People talk about this. Some academics that actually practice, and I also heard this about alchemy. For instance, some people who study the history of alchemy and practice, or the history of magic, and are also practitioners.
Well, but with the salary of an academic, it's very hard to be alchemist, because.
Yes.
Unless you actually found something valuable.
Unless you can turn things into. That would be fine. no more grants, no more. That would be really fun. But I think I always say, well, that's relatively innocent. If we go to the history of cannibalism, then we have to be worried about that.
Yeah, but it is interesting to see in the way that the discipline of the history of astrology has progressed, that we have, I would say, for the most part of the 20th century, people trying to talk about the history of astrology, but doing an incredible effort to convince others that they don't really believe in it,
and they need to do it.
And there's this detachment that you see constantly in text, especially the older ones. And now things have shifted in a way that it's go completely the way around, and even you have people who do practice astrology, and they're trying to see, well, yes, but here is a study which is clear and academic and proper, and it is a different, it's a completely different shift in the way people are studying. Yes.
Well, it will always be like kind of a polemic topic, and this part of its. That's what makes it interesting. Also, it's kind of never completely settled, and I think it will be like that.
Yes.
So,
well, I think
we covered a lot of.
We covered a lot
very
of topics,
interesting.
exactly.
I can find something, because the question you asked about the lady or man who become nude. Yes, I can find the just wait. This before. Oh no, I did a mistake. It's a man who becomes nude.
Oh, so this is very interesting for a lot of public.
It's probably my phantasm, but what's not the phantasm of the book, because the idea is here, yes, it's a man.
So no nude ladies, only nude men.
Nude men, yes.
Okay. Maybe we could find an image of the talisman and show it.
Reverse engineering.
It's in the second decan of the sign of Scorpio.
Oh.
You make an image of the nude man. You bury it in the middle of the way. And when a male person, a man, will come,
It will become nude.
he will become nude.
So when they say in the second decan of Scorpio, it's probably when the moon is in the second decan of Scorpio.
It's very. I have the text here. I have just a summary of because I quote this text in a little book, so I have not. I can manage to find the source, but I have to make some investigation in my library, so it's a bit long. But yes.
Well, we can try this year because we live in a very busy street, and we can see if it works. And now it's summer, so it's okay.
Exactly.
It's okay.
That's fine. Okay. Well, Professor, thank you very much for the lovely conversation. Very interesting topics that we got here, and a lot of interesting ideas and thoughts about all these studies and how they can go, and all the different perspectives that clash, and we have to be aware of when studying the topic. We hope to see you at some other times, perhaps to discuss a little bit more these curious and strange examples of the past, and talismans and images. And
thank you for your questions. Anyway,
and it was a pleasure to have you as our guest. So thank you, and we may see each other again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.